There is a country so large that if you drove from one end of it to the other without stopping, it would take you 6 days. 6 days of highway, 6 days of forest and prairie, and mountain and tundra and coast. 6 days of a landscape so enormous that entire ecosystems vanish inside it without a sound. 6 days, and you still would not have seen most of it. Canada is the second largest country on Earth. It covers nearly 10 million square kilometers. It has more lakes than every other country in the world combined. More than half of its land is covered by forest so dense and so continuous that from space it looks like a dark green ocean pressing against the top of the world. And inside all of that space, inside all of that silence, things have happened that do not have clean explanations. We tend to think of Canada as a particular kind of place, polite, reasonable, cold in the way that is more about manners than temperature, the kind of country that apologizes and means it. And that version of Canada is real. It exists. It has Tim Hortons and universal healthcare and a flag that people sew onto their backpacks when they travel internationally because it helps. But that version of Canada sits on top of something older and stranger and considerably more difficult to talk about. And the longer you look at the history, the deeper you follow the actual record of what has happened in this country and why, the more you realize that Canada has been quietly accumulating mysteries for centuries. Geological mysteries, historical mysteries, disappearances that were never resolved, deaths that were never explained, government programs so unusual that reading the declassified files feels like reading the wrong country's documents, natural phenomena that scientists have studied for decades and still cannot adequately account for, indigenous knowledge systems that were systematically suppressed and that, in retrospect, appear to have been correct about things that Western science took another 100 years to confirm. This is not a story about a country being secretly sinister. It is a story about a country being genuinely strange. There is a difference. Sinister implies intention. Strange implies something deeper, something structural, something that emerges from the particular combination of geography and history and silence that makes Canada what it is. Tonight we are going to go through it. Slowly, all the way through. We are going to talk about an island off the coast of Nova Scotia where people have been digging for 230 years, and where the deeper they go, the more they find. We are going to talk about a valley in the Northwest Territories, so remote and so associated with unexplained death that it acquired a nickname that the maps still carry. We are going to talk about a government scientist who spent years collecting evidence of unidentified aerial phenomena and whose files disappeared after he died. We are going to talk about a painter whose body was found in a lake and whose death was ruled an accident despite evidence that has never been adequately explained. We are going to talk about a UFO incident involving the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the United States Navy, and a craft that was tracked on radar before it went underwater. We are going to talk about extinctions and massacres and disappearances along a stretch of highway in northern British Columbia where the pattern became so undeniable that the United Nations eventually got involved. We are going to talk about all of it. So if you are comfortable, if you have found a position that feels right, if the light is low and the room is quiet, then let us begin. Because the deeper we dig into Canada, the stranger it gets. And we are going to dig very deep tonight. If you want to support this kind of storytelling, subscribing is the single best thing you can do. It helps more than you would think. And if you have a place you want to tell me about, somewhere in Canada or anywhere in the world where something happened that does not quite have a clean explanation, drop it in the comments. I read them. I take notes. Now, Let us start in the water. There's an island called Oak Island, and it sits in Mahone Bay on the southwestern shore of Nova Scotia, and it is not large. You could walk across it in 40 minutes. The terrain is mostly scrub oak and low brush, the kind of vegetation that grows in thin soil over limestone, and at a glance there is nothing about it that would cause you to stop. It is one of approximately 360 islands in Mahone Bay alone. The bay is full of them, small, wooded, unremarkable, except that in 1795, a 16-year-old boy named Daniel McGinnis rode out to Oak Island on his own, walked into the trees on the eastern end, and found something that has not been adequately explained in the 230 years since. What he found was a circular depression in the earth, roughly 4 meters across. In the center of the depression, directly overhead, a branch of an old oak tree had been cut and shaped into a crude pulley system. The branch was worn smooth from use. Something had been lowered into the hole, something heavy enough that they needed a pulley to move it, and something that whoever dug the hole did not want to leave above ground. Daniel McGinnis went back the next day with 2 friends. They began digging. 2 feet down, they hit a layer of flagstones. Flat stones, carefully laid, not native to that part of the island. Someone had brought them there specifically. They removed the stones and kept digging. At 10 feet, they hit a platform of solid oak logs, fitted so precisely into the shaft walls that it appeared to have been constructed by people who knew what they were doing. They removed the logs and kept digging. At 20 feet, another oak log platform. At 30 feet, another. They ran out of strength and resources and had to stop. But the depression was real. The logs were real. The flagstones were real. And that worn grooved branch was real. The story spread. In 1803, a company formed specifically to excavate the site brought equipment and more men and went deeper. At 40 feet, another oak platform. At 50 feet, another. At 60 feet, another. At 70 feet, the wood they struck was not oak, but coconut fiber. Coconut fiber, which cannot grow in Nova Scotia and would have had to have been imported from somewhere tropical. At 90 feet, they hit a large flat stone with markings carved into its surface. The markings have been described in various ways over the years. Some accounts say they formed a coded message. Others say the stone was simply marked with symbols that have never been definitively translated. The stone itself has since been lost. And then, at 93 feet, the shaft flooded overnight. Completely, top to bottom. The water appeared to have entered not from underground seepage, but through an engineered tunnel running from the shaft laterally to the beach. When excavators later investigated the beach, they found that it had been artificially constructed. The sand had been laid in layers with coconut fiber and eelgrass acting as filters, creating what engineers have since described as a functioning tidal collector system. The tunnel from the beach to the shaft meant that the moment anyone dug deep enough, the ocean would pour in and fill the hole. Someone had built a flood trap, a functioning, engineered flood trap, in the 1700s at the latest, on a small island off the coast of Nova Scotia, around something they had buried at least 90 feet underground. The question that 230 years of excavation has not answered is, what is it? Theories have accumulated the way sediment accumulates. Francis Bacon's manuscripts, in one of the more elaborate proposals, supposedly buried there by followers of the theory that Bacon wrote Shakespeare's plays. Pirate treasure, in one of the earlier and more persistent proposals, associated with names like Blackbeard or Captain Kidd, though neither had documented connections to Nova Scotia. Marie Antoinette's jewels, reportedly spirited out of France before the Revolution and shipped across the Atlantic. The original documents of the Knights Templar, protected by flood engineering, adapted from techniques used in ancient Mediterranean construction. The payroll of a British garrison. Acadian settlers who had somehow acquired wealth in extraordinary quantities before the British deportations of the 1750s and hidden it there before they were forced from their land. None of these theories has been confirmed. None has been eliminated. The shaft has been excavated by dozens of separate operations over 2 centuries, using increasingly sophisticated technology, and every time people get close to something, they either flood out, encounter collapsed structures from previous excavations, or find something that raises more questions than it answers. Wooden structures at depth, a hand-cut stone fragment inscribed with symbols. What appeared to be a human hand on one camera feed, later disputed. Evidence of multiple chambers at different depths. A drilled platform of compacted material at roughly 90 feet that has not been fully penetrated. At least 6 people have died on Oak Island. One in 1861 when a boiler explosion killed a worker during a pumping operation. 4 in 1965 when a team excavating one of the site's pits encountered what is believed to have been a pocket of hydrogen sulfide gas, and 4 men died before anyone could stop it. 1 in 1959 from injuries sustained in a separate mechanical failure. There is a saying, documented as far back as the early 20th century, that the treasure of Oak Island will not be found until 7 men have died looking for it. 6 have died. The excavation continues. The current operation has been running since 2006 and uses ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic surveys, core drilling, and underwater camera systems to map the site. What the surveys show is a series of underground voids and structures at depths consistent with what earlier excavators described. The engineering, to the extent that it can be assessed, is consistent with the early 18th century or possibly earlier. No culture or organization with documented presence in Nova Scotia before European settlement has been identified as the builder. The island sits in the bay. The shafts go down. The water comes in, and 230 years after a 16-year-old boy found a grooved oak branch in a clearing, nobody knows what is at the bottom. There is a place in Canada's Northwest Territories called the Nahanni Valley, and its official name is the South Nahanni River Valley, and it is one of the most remote places on the continent. To reach it, you fly into a small settlement and then travel by boat or float plane for hours through wilderness that does not have roads. The forest is boreal and very old. The mountains around it are called the Mackenzie Mountains, and they are not gentle. The river itself runs fast and cold through canyons whose walls rise hundreds of meters on both sides, and in those canyons the water sounds like nothing else you have ever heard. It is beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are completely indifferent to you. The valley has been called Headless Valley for more than 100 years. The name is not metaphorical. In the winter of 1905 and 1906, 2 brothers named Willie and Frank McLeod traveled into the Nahanni Valley to prospect for gold. They had heard, as many prospectors in that period had heard, that there was gold in those mountains. Not rumor gold, not hopeful speculation. Specific accounts passed through trading networks of placer deposits in the tributaries of the Nahanni. The brothers were experienced outdoorsmen. They knew the territory well enough. They went in with proper equipment and did not come back. In 1908, their remains were found in their sleeping bags on the bank of the river. Their bodies were intact. Their heads were not. The heads were never found. The story became widely known in the North and eventually made it into Southern newspapers, and it attracted the kind of attention that stories about headless men in wilderness tend to attract. But it was not an isolated incident. In 1917, another prospector named Martin Jorgensen was found burned in the ruins of his cabin. No cause for the fire was established. His head was also missing. In the 1940s, A miner named John Patterson was found in similar circumstances. In 1945, an American named Shebek was found dead of causes that were never established. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, reports accumulated of men who went into the valley and came back wrong, or did not come back at all, and of indigenous oral traditions warning specifically against traveling into certain parts of the valley, for reasons that the traditions did not fully explain. The Canadian government eventually addressed the situation in the way governments address unusual things, by investigating and then filing the results. The RCMP conducted multiple inquiries. The conclusions were consistently unsatisfying. The McLeod brothers might have been murdered by a person or persons unknown. The decapitations might have been performed by wildlife, though no wildlife species in North America consistently decapitates human remains and then removes the heads entirely from the scene. The fires might have been accidents. The disappearances might have been the result of the valley's extremely hazardous terrain and weather. Consistently might. What is documented and what is not disputed is that the Nahanni Valley has an unusually high rate of unexplained deaths among people who enter it. The Dean people, who have lived in the surrounding region for thousands of years, have oral traditions describing the valley as a place where unusual things happen and where caution is required. Their name for the river, Nahanni, is often translated as people of the West, in reference to a specific group, but the older name for the valley itself, in several Dene languages, refers to something closer to the place of the spirit people, or where the unknown lives. There is also, independently of the deaths and disappearances, a geological feature of the Nahanni Valley that has no parallel anywhere in Canada. In a latitude where the ground should be permafrost, frozen solid, the Nahanni Valley has hot springs, not warm springs, not mild springs, full thermal hot springs, with water temperatures reaching 48 degrees Celsius, that have created a microclimate in the valley where subtropical plants grow in conditions that by every regional standard should be impossible. The springs have no established volcanic source. The thermal energy that heats them comes from somewhere in the earth below the valley, and that somewhere has not been identified. The valley was declared a national park in 1972 and a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1978. It remains one of the least visited national parks in Canada. The access is difficult, the terrain is extreme, and the reputation, for people who know the history, lingers the way reputations linger when they are attached to things that have not been explained. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Canadian government was, like every other government in the world, paying close attention to reports of unidentified objects in the sky. The Second World War had ended. The Cold War was beginning. The possibility that unusual aerial phenomena might represent Soviet technology was being taken seriously by every military intelligence organization in the Western Alliance. What made Canada's response unusual was not the concern. It was the man they put in charge of it. His name was Wilbert Brockhouse Smith. He was a senior radio engineer for the Department of Transport, and by every account he was an exceptionally capable and methodical scientist. He held multiple patents. His work on radio propagation had been genuinely important. He was, professionally, the kind of man you would trust with serious technical analysis. In 1950, Smith attended a lecture in Washington, D.C., and came back to Ottawa with a proposal. He had, during his time in Washington, spoken with people connected to American intelligence and research establishments, and what he had learned had convinced him that the subject of unidentified aerial phenomena was not only real, but potentially the most significant scientific subject of the century. He wrote a memo. The memo was classified. Its classification was eventually removed in 1979, and when it was released, it turned out to be considerably more interesting than anyone had prepared for. In the memo, Smith reported that the matter of flying saucers was classified in the United States at a level higher than the hydrogen bomb. He reported that American scientists believed the craft were real, that they were not Soviet, and that a small group of senior scientists was actively working on the propulsion question. He proposed that Canada establish its own research project to study magnetic phenomena related to UFO propulsion, not from a position of mere interest, but from a position of scientific urgency, because whoever understood the propulsion first would hold an advantage that made nuclear technology look incremental. The Canadian government approved the project. It was called Project Magnet. From 1950 to 1954, Smith led a team that collected data on unidentified aerial phenomena from across Canada, analyzed reports submitted by military and civilian observers, and conducted instrumental research at a dedicated station in Shirley's Bay, Ontario, outside Ottawa. The station was equipped with a gamma ray detector, a magnetometer, a radio receiver, and an ionospheric disturbance detector. The idea was to instrument a location and wait for something unusual to occur within range of the instruments. On August 8, 1954, something occurred. The instruments at Shirley's Bay triggered simultaneously. The gamma ray counter, the magnetometer, the radio receiver, all of them activated together, registering anomalous readings that lasted for approximately 1 minute. Smith and a colleague were in the station when it happened. They ran outside. The sky over Shirley's Bay was overcast and foggy, and they could not see anything. Smith filed the incident report. The readings were anomalous and did not correspond to any known natural phenomenon or any identified aircraft. The equipment was checked. It was functioning correctly. The incident remained unexplained. 3 months later, the Department of Transport shut down Project Magnet. The official reason was that it had been a research exercise, and the research had reached its natural conclusion. Smith continued working privately and continued writing about his research and his beliefs, which had become, by the end of his life, considerably broader than the instrumental study of magnetic anomalies. He died in 1962. After his death, his files disappeared. Not all of them. Some were recovered. Some were donated to institutions. But a significant portion of the files that Smith had accumulated during and after Project Magnet, including correspondence with American researchers and analysis documents related to specific incident reports, were not found in his home or office after his death. They have not been located since. The National Research Council of Canada had a parallel project running at the same time as Project Magnet, collecting UFO reports from across the country. Between 1950 and the project's conclusion, they collected more than 10,000 reports. The files are held in Library and Archives Canada. They are accessible to researchers, and they contain, among thousands of reports that have conventional explanations, a number that do not. The most frequently cited is from October 4th, 1967, and it concerns Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia. Shag Harbor is a fishing village on the southwestern tip of Nova Scotia, small and quiet and close to the water in the way that fishing villages are. On the night of October 4th, 1967, multiple witnesses across a wide area observed a large object with flashing lights crossing the sky at low altitude before descending rapidly toward the surface of the ocean. The object did not crash. It did not strike the water violently. It appeared to land on the water and float briefly before beginning to sink. The witnesses included commercial pilots who reported the object to Moncton Air Traffic Control. They included RCMP officers who watched from the shore. They included fishermen who were close enough to smell something described as sulfurous in the water, near where the object had gone down. The RCMP officers on shore immediately contacted the Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax, reporting an aircraft down at sea. Fishing vessels went out within minutes. The Canadian Coast Guard was dispatched. The RCMP brought boats from shore. When they reached the location where the object had been observed to sink, they found something on the surface of the water, a yellow foam. A foam unlike anything any of the experienced fishermen on the scene had seen before, consistent across all eyewitness accounts, and dense enough that it left marks on the hulls of the rescue vessels. There was no debris, no aircraft wreckage, no bodies, no survivors, no life preservers, nothing that you would expect to find at the scene of an aircraft accident. The object was not on the surface. It had gone under. The Canadian military was notified. The Royal Canadian Navy dispatched vessels to the area and conducted a search that lasted several days. The search included the area of ocean floor in the vicinity of the sinking, which in that part of Nova Scotia has a particular bathymetry, a series of deep channels between shallow banks that would have made underwater search difficult, but not impossible for naval vessels equipped for it. The official investigation concluded that the object was unidentified. This is not unusual. The majority of official UFO investigations produce unidentified conclusions. What is unusual about Shag Harbor is the accumulation of credentialed, independent witnesses, the physical trace evidence of the foam, the immediate government response, and a detail that emerged decades later when military personnel involved in the investigation began speaking more openly. During the naval search of the ocean floor, according to accounts given by people who were involved in the operation, the object was located. It was tracked on sonar, moving along the bottom of the channel toward an area near Shelburne, Nova Scotia, where a submarine detection facility had been operating during the Cold War. The object moved. It was not inert on the seafloor. It was moving. And when a second unidentified object appeared on sonar and appeared to join the first, the combined objects, or whatever they were, began moving out into the Atlantic and were eventually lost. The official file on Shag Harbor, released under access to information requests, confirms the basic facts. The witnesses, the search, the foam, the conclusion of unidentified, the subsequent details, the sonar tracking, the second object, the movement out to sea, come from testimony rather than official record, and testimony is not the same as documentation. But the foam was real, the witnesses were real, the military response was real, and the object, whatever it was, has never been identified. Tom Thomson was one of the most important painters in Canadian history. He is frequently grouped with, and in fact preceded and influenced, the Group of Seven, the painters whose images of the Canadian wilderness became so widely reproduced that they are now inseparable from how Canadians imagine their own landscape. His paintings of Algonquin Park, where he worked as a guide and spent most of the last years of his life, are in major museums. They are taught in schools. They are reproduced on everything. He died in July of 1917 in Algonquin Park, and the official conclusion was accidental drowning. Almost nothing about the circumstances of his death has ever fully satisfied that conclusion. Thomson was an experienced canoeist. He had spent years on the lakes and rivers of Algonquin Park and was known by other guides and rangers as someone who was comfortable in water and boats in conditions that would be challenging for less experienced people. On July 8th, 1917, he set out alone in his canoe on Canoe Lake in Algonquin Park. His body was found 8 days later, floating in the lake. His canoe was found overturned shortly after he disappeared. The coroner's inquest was held quickly. The conclusion was accidental drowning. Thomson was buried in a small cemetery near Canoe Lake, but when his body was found, it had been in the water for 8 days. His fishing line was wrapped around one ankle multiple times in a way that was inconsistent with accidental entanglement. There was a bruise on his left temple of a type and size that some medical observers later described as consistent with a blow rather than with a fall or collision with a rock or canoe edge. And the people who prepared his body for burial reported, quietly, and to people they trusted, rather than in any official setting, that there was a wound in his left temple that was not consistent with the stated cause of death. Thompson had been involved, in the months before his death, in a complicated personal situation. There were romantic entanglements that were causing difficulty. There were tensions at Canoe Lake between Thompson and at least one other person, a man named Martin Blesher, who is known to have had an argument with Thompson in the days before his disappearance. Blesher was German-American, and Thompson was reportedly outspoken about the war. What the argument was about was never documented. The family eventually decided to move Thompson's body to the family plot in Leith, Ontario. An undertaker was sent to Canoe Lake to exhume the body and transport it. What happened at that point became, decades later, the source of the central mystery. In 1956, 4 decades after Thompson's death, a group of men excavating near the original burial site found a human skull. The skull had a hole in the left temple. The group included a park ranger and several others, and they examined the skull closely enough to note its condition and the nature of the wound before they filled in the excavation and reported what they had found. The question that followed was obvious. Had the undertaker actually moved Thompson's body to Leith, or had the casket transported in 1917 been empty, or contained something other than remains? And if Thompson's body was still at Canoe Lake, what did the hole in the skull mean? An official examination of the Leith gravesite was eventually conducted by researchers from the University of Toronto. They found remains. The analysis suggested the remains were consistent with Thompson's age and general physical description. But the analysis also found that the remains were extremely fragmentary, and the conclusions that could be drawn from them were limited. The skull found in 1956 near Canoe Lake has never been officially identified. It has never been definitively connected to Thompson. It has also never been definitively excluded. Thompson's death has been the subject of books, documentary films, and academic papers for more than 100 years. The accidental drowning conclusion has never been officially revised. And the painting in the Art Gallery of Ontario, called The West Wind, which Thompson completed in 1917, the year he died, remains one of the most reproduced images in Canadian cultural history. A pine tree bending in wind over a dark lake, the sky behind it turbulent and cold, the water below it completely still. There is a stretch of highway in northern British Columbia that runs through some of the most remote land in the country. It connects the city of Prince George in the south to Prince Rupert on the coast and to the Alaska Highway further north. For much of its length, it passes through terrain where communities are separated by hours of driving and where the landscape on both sides of the road is forest and mountain and silence. The highway has a name on maps, Highway 16, but for decades the people who live along it have called it something else. They call it the Highway of Tears. The name comes from the pattern. Beginning in 1969 and continuing through the decades that followed, women and girls have disappeared from this stretch of highway. They are found later, or they are not found at all. The rate of disappearance along this corridor is so far above the statistical baseline for any comparable stretch of highway in Canada that it attracted national attention, then parliamentary attention, and eventually the attention of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because the vast majority of the victims are Indigenous women. The RCMP has officially attributed at least 18 disappearances and deaths to the Highway of Tears corridor. Advocacy organizations and family groups who have tracked the cases independently put the number considerably higher, in some estimates above 40, when cases that the RCMP attributes to other causes or as not officially connected to the corridor are included. The pattern is consistent: women traveling between communities along the highway, often hitchhiking because the highway has no public transit connecting the communities along it, disappear. Some are found, some are never found. The cases span more than 50 years. They involve different perpetrators in the cases that have been solved, which means this is not the work of one person operating over time. The highway itself is producing disappearances at a rate that the terrain, the isolation, the lack of transit, infrastructure, and the vulnerability of women traveling alone in remote areas combine to create. Some families have waited for decades for answers. Some have buried a child without ever knowing what happened. Some have buried the cases themselves, the way you bury things that are too heavy to carry, and tried to continue. The federal government launched a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls that ran from 2016 to 2019. The final report, released in 2019, used language that was careful and specific. It found that the violence against Indigenous women and girls in Canada amounted to genocide. The word was chosen deliberately. The commissioners explained their reasoning carefully. The response from the government was a commitment to action. The highway is still there. The communities along it still have no public transit connecting them. The women who need to travel between those communities still face the same choices they have always faced. The United Nations has continued to monitor the situation. In a suburb of Ottawa, in a town called Carp, Ontario, there is a facility built into the side of a hill that from the outside looks like a concrete block surrounded by grass. There are no windows. The entrance is a heavy blast door. The power systems and air filtration and communications equipment inside were designed to function for 30 days without any contact with the outside world. It was built to house the Canadian government in the event of nuclear war. Its official name was the Diefenbunker, a name coined by critics of Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, who authorized its construction in 1959. The name stuck. The bunker was completed in 1961 at a cost that was classified for decades, and it remained operational as a government emergency facility until 1994, when the Cold War's end made its original purpose obsolete. The facility has 4 levels, built entirely underground. The bottom level, accessible only by a stairwell and a dedicated elevator, was reserved for the Prime Minister, the Governor General, and senior cabinet ministers. It had a war cabinet room equipped with a direct communications line to NORAD headquarters in Colorado, a vault for the preservation of financial records, and the Bank of Canada's gold reserves, a CBC broadcasting studio from which the government would have addressed whatever population remained after the strike, and living quarters for a selected group of approximately 500 people who would have been brought to the bunker in the event of an alert. The 500 people were chosen. Their names were on a list. The list did not include, by design, the families of the people on the list. The reasoning was operational. The bunker could house 500. Families would complicate evacuation logistics and reduce the pool of working personnel. This was the calculus that was made and documented and classified, and it remained classified for years after the facility was decommissioned. The Diefenbunker is now a museum. You can tour it. You can walk through the decontamination showers and the communications rooms and stand in the war cabinet room where the Prime Minister and 6 senior ministers would have sat and made decisions about what remained of the country, while the world outside the blast door was something else entirely. The museum is thorough and well organized, and the staff are knowledgeable. There is something about walking through a facility designed for the end of the world that does not let you entirely stay on the surface of what you're looking at. The list of 500 people existed. It was real. Somewhere in those files, names were written down, and other names were not, and the people whose names were not written down did not know that. They went about their lives not knowing that a calculation had been made and that the calculation had found them expendable. Canada has never had a nuclear detonation on its soil. The facility was never activated. The list was never used. The museum closes at 5 o'clock. The Beothuk people lived on the island of Newfoundland for thousands of years. Their territory encompassed the entire island. Their culture was adapted with extraordinary precision to the landscape they inhabited, with seasonal movements between coastal and interior locations, a sophisticated knowledge of the island's ecology, and a material culture that used red ochre extensively, a practice that gave rise to the term Red Indians, which European explorers applied first to the Beothuk, and which was then misapplied to indigenous peoples across the entire continent. The Beothuk were not wiped out in war. They were not expelled in the way that some peoples were expelled. What happened to them was slower and more structural, and in some ways harder to categorize, which may be part of why it is not more widely known. European settlement of Newfoundland's coastline in the 16th and 17th centuries gradually displaced the Beothuk from the coastal areas where they fished and gathered. The fish that the Beothuk had relied on were increasingly being harvested by European settlers. The coastal areas were becoming occupied by people who were armed and who sometimes shot at the Beothuk on sight, not as policy, but as the accumulated result of individual decisions made by individual settlers who were afraid of or hostile toward people they did not understand. The Beothuk retreated into the interior of the island. The interior of Newfoundland is not an easy place to live. The coastal resources that had sustained Beothuk culture were no longer accessible. The population, which had never been large, began to decline, not from violence alone, but from the combination of displacement, loss of food, resources, and the diseases that European contact had introduced. By the early 19th century, the Beothuk population was in the single digits. The colonial government, becoming aware of the situation, made efforts to establish contact and potentially provide some form of protection or assistance. Several Beothuk individuals were brought into colonial settlements. The interactions were not without a kind of anguished good intention on some sides, but the population was already below any sustainable threshold. The last known Beothuk was a woman named Shan Audithit. She had been captured in 1823 and brought to St. John's, where she lived with various colonial families, and eventually with a Scottish surveyor named William Epps Cormack, who was genuinely interested in Beothuk culture, and who spent time with her learning what he could about the language and practices of her people. Shanodithit drew maps and pictures of Beothuk life and culture that are still held in archives, some of the only remaining primary records of who the Beothuk were. She died of tuberculosis on June 6, 1829. She was approximately 29 years old. With her death, the Beothuk were gone. An entire people, a culture that had existed on the island of Newfoundland for at least 4,000 years, was gone. Not defeated, not relocated, simply ended. The last speaker of their language died without another speaker. The specific knowledge that accumulates in a culture over 4,000 years, the plant knowledge, the navigation knowledge, the stories, the names of places in the language of the people who had lived there the longest, all of it ended in a single generation. The Beothuk language is classified as extinct. Linguists have worked with the records Shanodithit left and with other fragmentary historical sources to document what they can. But a language is not a list of words. A language is a way of organizing the world. And that organization for the Beothuk is gone. Newfoundland joined Canada in 1949. The land that the Beothuk had inhabited was Canadian territory by then. though the people themselves had been gone for 120 years. In 1942, the Canadian government established a facility on the eastern shore of Hudson Bay in northern Quebec at a location called Fort Churchill, and then in 1946 moved its primary research operations to a facility in Churchill, Manitoba, that would eventually become one of the strangest research sites in North American scientific history. Churchill sits at the edge of the boreal forest where the trees finally give out and the tundra begins. Hudson Bay is directly to the east. The town is accessible by rail and by air. In November, the polar bears come. This is not a metaphor. The polar bears of western Hudson Bay gather near Churchill every autumn because the town is at the point where the bay freezes first, and the bears wait there for the ice to form so they can go out onto the bay and hunt. The bears are enormous, and they are wild, and they walk through the town. The town has adapted to this. There is a polar bear alert system. There is a holding facility where bears that enter the town are kept until they can be relocated. There are rules about leaving food out and rules about what you can and cannot do when you encounter a bear on the street, which is a thing that happens. But the bears are not the strangest thing about Churchill. In 1957, the Churchill Research Range was established as part of the International Geophysical Year, an 18-month international science collaboration involving 67 countries. The Canadian government, in partnership with the United States military and NASA's predecessor agency, began using the Churchill Range to launch rockets into the upper atmosphere for research purposes. Over the following decades, more than 3,000 rockets were launched from Churchill. The atmospheric research conducted there contributed to the understanding of the northern lights, cosmic radiation, and the structure of the ionosphere. What the rockets found in the upper atmosphere over Churchill, in the detailed particle and energy measurements that came back in the data, include a band of intense radiation that the researchers had not predicted and that required significant revision of existing models of Earth's magnetosphere. The Churchill data was central to the understanding of what are now called the Van Allen radiation belts, the zones of intense particle radiation that surround the Earth and that have significant implications for space travel. This is not unusual science. The results were published. The research was shared internationally, but the Churchill site, over its operational history, also produced a body of atmospheric and geophysical data that included unexplained readings, electromagnetic anomalies, particle detection events that did not correspond to known sources, readings that the researchers noted carefully and filed, and which, when you go back to the archives and look at them, describe something in the upper atmosphere over northern Manitoba that was not at the time within the explanatory framework they were working with. The range is still operational. Churchill still exists. The polar bears still come in November. The launches still happen. And the ionosphere above Churchill still produces readings that the instruments catch and that the researchers write down very carefully before moving on to the next launch. The Donnelly family came to Canada from County Tipperary in Ireland in 1844. James Donnelly, the patriarch, settled with his wife Johanna and their children on a farm in Biddulph Township in what is now southwestern Ontario, and for the first years they built the kind of life that Irish immigrants built in Canada in the mid-19th century, which was not an easy life, but was a coherent one. The trouble began with land. James Donnelly had settled on land that was already claimed by another settler, and the dispute that followed set the Donnelly family on a trajectory that would end 30 years later in one of the most brutal nights in Ontario history. The Donnelly sons were numerous and combative. They were involved in fights, in property disputes, in the kind of ongoing rural conflict that in a community of Irish immigrants in the mid-19th century operated on codes of loyalty and grievance that the broader Canadian legal system was not well equipped to adjudicate. James Donnelly served time in prison for killing a man in a fight at a logging bee. The family's reputation hardened into something specific. They were people you did not cross, and if you crossed them anyway, there would be consequences. The community around them was not passive. A group called the Biddulph Peace Society was formed, which, despite its name, was essentially a vigilante organization organized around the desire to remove the Donnelly family from the community by whatever means proved necessary. On the night of February 4th, 1880, a group of men assembled at the Donnelly farm. What happened next is documented in the historical record with uncomfortable precision because there was a survivor, a young cousin of the family named Johnny O'Connor, who was in the house and who hid under a bed and watched through a gap in the boards. The men who came that night killed James Donnelly. They killed Johanna Donnelly. They killed 3 of the sons who were present. They killed a niece who was visiting. They set fire to the house. They then went to a neighboring Donnelly property and killed another son there. 6 members of the Donnelly family were dead by morning. Arrests were made, trials were held. 2 trials, in fact, because the first produced a hung jury. The second produced an acquittal. The identities of the men who had been present on the night of the murders were known to a significant number of people in Biddulph Township. Nobody was convicted. Nobody served a day in prison for the deaths of 6 people. The Donnelly family massacre remains one of the most significant unsolved mass murders in Canadian history. The descendants of the Donnelly family are still there. The farmhouse site is still there. The graveyard where they are buried still exists, and the stones have James and Johanna's names, and the dates that bracket the violent end of a family that had, for 30 years, refused to be intimidated by anyone. Nobody was ever convicted. The men who did it went home that night and went to sleep in their houses and got up the next morning, and the sun came up over Biddulph Township, and they were still there and the Donnellys were not. Canada has, for most of its history, been acutely aware of its position between 2 things: the British Empire and then the Commonwealth on one side and the United States on the other. This position has shaped Canadian foreign policy, Canadian culture, Canadian identity, and Canadian military posture in ways that are sometimes obvious and sometimes almost invisible. In the 1950s, as the Cold War deepened and the possibility of nuclear exchange became the organizing principle of Western military planning, Canada and the United States reached an agreement that would tie the 2 countries together in continental defense in a way that has never been fully dissolved. NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, was formalized in 1958. It integrated Canadian and American early warning systems, radar networks, and fighter interceptor forces under a joint command structure with headquarters in Colorado. What this meant, practically, was that Canadian airspace was incorporated into an American defense system, and that decisions about how to respond to unidentified objects entering North American airspace would be made jointly by a command structure that was permanently located in the United States. The radar network that NORAD relied on included, on the Canadian side, a system called the Distant Early Warning Line, the DEW line, which ran across the northern edge of the continent from Alaska through the Canadian Arctic to Greenland. 58 radar stations built in some of the most remote and hostile terrain on the continent, staffed continuously, watching the sky to the north for what might be coming from the Soviet Union over the polar route. Building the DEW line required bringing thousands of construction workers and military personnel into the Canadian Arctic. It required establishing supply chains across terrain that had no infrastructure. It required the displacement, disruption, or forced relocation of Inuit communities that had been living in those areas, some of whose traditional land was simply built on without consultation or agreement. The environmental legacy of the DEW line is substantial. The stations were eventually decommissioned beginning in the 1980s, and the cleanup of the sites, which included fuel storage, electrical equipment, and construction materials deposited across the Arctic over decades, has been ongoing for 40 years. The contamination at some sites has been significant. Soil and water testing at former DEW line locations has found petroleum products, PCBs, and heavy metals at levels that required, and in some cases are still requiring, remediation. The communities whose land was used have been involved in the cleanup discussions. The negotiations over remediation, liability, and the recognition of the impact on indigenous communities have been long and not always straightforward. The DEW line is gone, the sites remain, the Arctic remains, and the sky over the Canadian North is still being watched, though by different systems now, from different locations, for different things than what they were originally looking for. In the late 18th century, British explorers began attempting to navigate what they called the Northwest Passage, the sea route through the Arctic archipelago that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and allow ships to reach Asia without going around South America. The route existed in theory. The question was whether the ice conditions in the Canadian Arctic would ever allow it to be navigated in practice. The attempts were many, the failures were many, and the most catastrophic failure, the one that generated the most documentation and the most subsequent inquiry and the most enduring questions, was the Franklin expedition of 1845. Sir John Franklin led two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, into the Arctic in May of 1845. They were last seen by European observers in late July of that year, entering Lancaster Sound, the entrance to the archipelago. They were never seen again. The search for the Franklin expedition occupied the British Admiralty for years. More than 30 separate expeditions were sent to the Arctic between 1848 and 1859, looking for the ships, their crews, or any evidence of what had happened. The expeditions found fragments, written notes, cairns, skeletons, a message, eventually, left in a cairn on King William Island that gave a partial account. The ships had been frozen in ice near King William Island in September 1846. They had remained frozen for 19 months, and in April 1848, Franklin himself had died, and the surviving crew had abandoned the ships and attempted to march south toward the Back River, more than 1,000 kilometers from any inhabited settlement, through terrain they did not know, in conditions that killed them. All 129 men died. None reached safety. Their bodies were found across a wide area of the southern Arctic archipelago over the following century, as search and survey expeditions occasionally turned up remains. What happened to them in those 2 years of being frozen in the ice has been analyzed extensively, and the analysis has produced a picture that is genuinely grim. Forensic examination of skeletal remains found evidence of scurvy, of starvation, and of lead poisoning. The ship's food supplies, which were in sealed tin cans, appear to have been contaminated with lead solder, and the accumulated lead load in the crew systems over the 19 months they were frozen may have caused cognitive impairment that affected their decision-making. There is also evidence in the skeletal remains of cut marks consistent with processing of human tissue, which the researchers who found it treated carefully, and which the historical record has incorporated into the understanding that in the final stages the survivors were doing what people do when they are dying in the snow and there is nothing else left. Inuit oral traditions in the region had preserved accounts of encounters with the Franklin crew during the expedition's final stages. The accounts described men who were thin and sick, who seemed confused, who were moving south in ways that suggested they did not know where they were going. The accounts were gathered by researchers who went to the Arctic specifically to interview Inuit communities in the 1860s and they were incorporated into the historical record. The two ships were found within the last 15 years. HMS Erebus was located by a Canadian search team in 2014 in the water south of King William Island. HMS Terror was located in 2016, further south than anyone had expected, in a location consistent with Inuit oral traditions that had placed the ship there. Both ships are in relatively good condition. Archaeological excavation has been conducted at both sites. Inside HMS Terror, which sat in shallow enough water that divers could enter it, the ship appeared to have been in good condition when it sank. The stores were in order, drawers were closed, everything was in its place. The ship looked less like a vessel that had been abandoned in chaos and more like one that had been left behind in some deliberation, by people who had prepared to go somewhere, before it slipped under the water and froze into the sediment. Where those people were going, whether they knew where they were going, whether any of them had any real hope when they left the ship, the record does not fully say. There is a mine in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, that has a name that is now inseparable from what happened inside it. The Westray mine was a coal mine in Pictou County that began operations in 1991. The coal seam it was built on was known to be difficult and potentially dangerous. The rock formations in that part of Nova Scotia produce coal in seams that are prone to methane accumulation and to the buildup of coal dust, both of which can ignite. The company that operated Westray was aware of the risks. Provincial and federal mining inspectors were aware of the risks. There were, in the months before the explosion, multiple reports of unsafe conditions filed by mine workers and by inspectors who visited the site. The reports documented methane levels that exceeded safe operating limits. They documented coal dust accumulation on the mine surfaces that, in the event of any ignition source, would carry a fireball through the tunnels faster than anyone could outrun it. They documented equipment being used in conditions where it should not have been used, and workers being pressured to continue working in conditions where the regulations said they should not. On May 9, 1992, at 5:30 in the morning, a methane pocket ignited in the depths of the Westray mine. The resulting explosion, amplified by the coal dust on the tunnel walls, killed 26 men. Some were killed instantly. Some were trapped in sections of the mine that did not immediately collapse, and the rescue teams that attempted to reach them could not get through. None of the 26 were recovered from the mine. The bodies are still there. The mine was sealed. The shaft that had killed 26 people was closed, and the families were told that recovery was not possible. There was a public inquiry. The inquiry, conducted by Justice Richard and completed in 1997, produced a report that described in careful, measured, devastating language how the deaths had happened and who bore responsibility. The title of the section of the report that dealt with accountability was "The Westray Story, A Predictable Path to Disaster." Predictable. The word was chosen carefully. Criminal charges were laid against 2 managers. The charges did not result in convictions. The Nova Scotia Court of Appeal eventually stayed the proceedings. The company, Cura Resources, went bankrupt. No one was ever convicted of anything related to the deaths of 26 men in conditions that multiple inspectors had documented as unsafe. The public response to the failure of the criminal justice system to produce convictions eventually led to amendments to the Criminal Code of Canada. In 2004, Parliament passed what became known as the Westray Bill, formerly Bill C-45, which amended the Criminal Code to make it easier to hold corporations criminally liable for the deaths of workers caused by negligence. The bill passed. It became law. In the years since the Westray Bill became law, it has been used in criminal prosecutions related to worker deaths a small number of times. The convictions have been few. The mine is still sealed. The 26 men are still in it. The families are still in Pictou County. There are certain lakes in Canada that do not behave in entirely expected ways. Spotted Lake in British Columbia, near the town of Osheus, is one of them. The lake is small and sits in a valley in the Okanagan region, and in summer, when the water evaporates in the heat, what is left behind is a pattern of circular pools, separated by mineral deposits that gives the lake surface the appearance of an enormous map or a biological specimen under magnification. Each of the circular pools has a distinct color, ranging from white to pale green to brilliant yellow to deep blue, depending on the specific mineral composition of that pool's deposits. The minerals include magnesium, sulfate, calcium, and sodium sulfates, and in summer the water in the pools is so concentrated that you can float in it effortlessly. The Syilx people, whose territory encompasses the Okanagan Valley, have known about Spotted Lake for thousands of years. Their name for it is Kliluk. The lake was considered sacred, a healing place, and access to it was regulated by protocols specific to the site. The minerals from its surface were used medicinally, and the lake itself was understood as a source of power that required respect in how you approached it. During the First World War, the mineral deposits at Spotted Lake were harvested and used in the production of ammunition. The harvesting continued for several years. The Syilx people did not consent to this. The lake was purchased by a non-indigenous farmer in the 1970s and fenced off from public access for decades. The Okanagan Indian Band campaigned for years to have the lake returned to indigenous stewardship. In 2001, the lake was purchased back by the band after a campaign that involved negotiation with the provincial and federal governments. Spotted Lake is now under the stewardship of the Syilx Nation. The fence is still there, not to keep people from a private property, but to protect the lake from the pressure of tourism that the lake's unusual appearance generates. People drive from significant distances to look at it. The circular pools and their colors are genuinely remarkable, and you can understand why people come. The lake asks, in its way, for something in return for being looked at. In the province of Manitoba, in the southern portion of Lake Manitoba, there have been reports for more than 100 years of a large, unknown creature in the water. The creature has been called Manipago, by analogy with the more famous Ogopogo of Okanagan Lake, in British Columbia, itself named by analogy with Nessie of Loch Ness in Scotland. The reports from Lake Manitoba are numerous. They come from fishermen, from recreational boaters, from people on the lake's shores. They describe a long neck, a large body, movement in the water that is inconsistent with any known species. In 1960, a group of 17 people on separate boats reported seeing the creature simultaneously and described it in consistent terms as a large, dark, sinuous animal approximately 12 meters in length. Lake Manitoba is large enough to conceal an unknown animal. It is 706 square kilometers of water, much of it relatively shallow, with extensive reed beds along its margins and channels connecting it to other lakes in the Manitoba Lake system. The underwater visibility in much of the lake is limited. Systematic biological survey of a body of water that size is not a simple undertaking. Okanagan Lake in British Columbia, where Ogopogo is reported, has a different character. It is a deep, cold, fjord-like lake in a glaciated valley, with depths exceeding 230 meters in places. The reports from Okanagan Lake are even more numerous and consistent than those from Manitoba. The Syilx people have a name for the creature in Okanagan Lake that predates European contact, and the name translates approximately to the sacred creature of the lake, not as a fairy tale figure, but as a reference to something that was understood to actually exist and to be present in the water. The scientific position is that no large unknown species exists in North American fresh water, because if it did, we would have found physical evidence of it by now. The fossil record would include it. Bodies would have been found. Genetic material would be detectable in water samples. This is a reasonable position. The counter to it, which is not unreasonable, is that Lake Manitoba and Okanagan Lake are large, that large unknown organisms can avoid detection in large water bodies for extended periods, and that the consistent reporting across cultures and centuries of something in these specific lakes is not easily explained by ordinary misidentification, because experienced lake users know what fish and logs and waves look like, and they continue reporting something that is not those things. The lake is cold. The water is dark. The reeds along the margins are very tall. In the winter months in Canada, particularly in the northern regions, there is a condition that Indigenous peoples across the continent had been documenting and managing for centuries before European contact reached them. The condition involves a person becoming withdrawn from their community, refusing food, behaving in ways that are increasingly out of character, and in severe cases becoming dangerous to themselves and to others. The Algonquian peoples had a name for the most extreme form of this condition: Wendigo. The Wendigo, in the spiritual understanding of multiple Algonquian nations, was a being of winter and hunger and isolation, a creature born from the worst that the season could do to a person, and the fear of becoming one was real and specific and shaped by an accurate understanding of what cold and starvation and extreme isolation could do to a human mind. Wendigo psychosis is a term that appeared in anthropological literature in the 20th century, used to describe reports from historical records and early ethnographic work of individuals who became convinced that they were transforming into a Wendigo, who experienced intense cravings for human flesh, and who in some documented cases were killed by their own communities when they became dangerous. The anthropological debate over Wendigo psychosis is long and not fully resolved. Some scholars have argued that the condition is a genuine culture-bound syndrome, a psychological state shaped by specific cultural frameworks that creates a particular set of symptoms. Others have argued that the historical reports were exaggerated or misinterpreted by European observers who misunderstood indigenous frameworks. Others still have pointed out that extreme isolation, starvation, and severe cold produce documented psychological effects that are cross-cultural, and that the Algonquian framework for understanding those effects was simply more precise and culturally specific than anything European medicine produced until much later. What is not in dispute is that the winter in the Canadian North is capable of producing conditions under which human psychology becomes unreliable. The darkness, the cold, the isolation, the periods when the nearest other person is days of travel away, the specific quality of deprivation that comes when the food runs out and the snow is still on the ground and there is no way to know how much longer it will last. The winter endures. The land holds. The people who have lived in it for thousands of years built knowledge systems specifically to survive it, and the knowledge systems worked, and they were still working when the new people arrived with their different frameworks and their different understanding of what the land was and what it asked of the people who lived on it. There is a point at which the strangeness of a country stops being a collection of individual stories and starts being something structural, a pattern, a quality of the place itself. Canada is a country built on land that was already full of knowledge when the Europeans arrived, full of place names and seasonal knowledge and ecological understanding and spiritual frameworks that had been refined over thousands of years into something that worked. The rivers had names. The dangerous places had warnings. The mountains had stories that contained information about the mountains. A significant portion of that knowledge was suppressed. The residential school system, which operated in Canada from the 1880s to 1996, took Indigenous children from their communities and placed them in institutions where they were prohibited from speaking their languages, practicing their traditions, or maintaining connections to their families. The system was explicitly designed to eliminate Indigenous culture. The cultural knowledge that took thousands of years to accumulate could not survive the severing of intergenerational transmission. In 2021, ground-penetrating radar surveys at the sites of former residential schools began finding unmarked graves. The first major announcement came from Tk'emlúps te Secwépemc Nation in British Columbia, where ground-penetrating radar indicated the presence of 215 unmarked graves at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. Similar surveys at other former school sites found hundreds more. The discoveries were not entirely surprising to Indigenous communities, who had been saying for decades that children had died at the schools and had not been returned to their families. The records of the institutions were incomplete. The death records that existed were not always matched to burial records. The burial records that existed did not always indicate where on the property the burials had taken place. Canada has a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whose final report, completed in 2015, documented the history and the legacy of the residential school system in detail. The report used the phrase cultural genocide. The 2021 discoveries and the surveys that followed at sites across the country added a dimension to the record that the documentation had not fully conveyed. The children who died at those schools have names. Families have been waiting for those names. The surveys continue. The archives continue to be searched. The full accounting is not yet complete. The mystery at Oak Island is still being excavated. The Nahanni Valley still has its thermal springs and its history. Tom Thompson's paintings still hang in museums, and the lake where he died still reflects the sky in the same way it always has, indifferent to the question of what happened. The highway of tears is still a highway. The women who have disappeared from it are still missing. The Diefenbunker is a museum now. You can walk through it. The blast doors open. The Beothuk are gone, and what Shanna Dithit drew on paper in a surveyor's house in St. John's in the 1820s is some of the only record of what they were. Wilbert Smith's files have not been found. The object that went into the water at Shag Harbor has not been identified. The DUW line sites are still being cleaned up. The Arctic is warming. The permafrost is thawing in places where it has been frozen for thousands of years, and as it thaws, things that were preserved in it are becoming visible again. Canada is 10 million square kilometers of landscape and several thousand years of recorded history, and considerably more than that of unrecorded history, and the ratio of what is known to what is not known is a ratio that continues to shift as you look at it. The Oak Island money pit goes down at least 90 feet and possibly further. The flood trap still works. The water still comes in when you get close to whatever's at the bottom. The Nahanni River still runs cold and fast through canyons where the walls go up hundreds of meters on both sides. The hot springs still steam in the valley where the permafrost should be. The polar bears still come to Churchill in November, walking through town in the dark, enormous and patient, waiting for the ice to form. And somewhere in the archives, in the files that were not lost, and the records that were carefully kept, and the testimonies that were taken down by hand by people who believed. What they were recording mattered. There are answers to some of these questions. Partial answers, answers that raise further questions, the kind of answers that a country produces when it is large enough to contain contradictions and old enough to have accumulated secrets and honest enough, at least some of the time, to have written things down. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets. That is not a warning. That is an invitation. If you made it to the end of this, thank you, genuinely. This took a long time to put together, and it matters that you stayed with it. If there is something you want to add, something I missed, or got wrong, or something that happened in your province or your region that belongs in a conversation like this, put it in the comments. I am always reading. If you want to see more of this, subscribing is the thing that makes it possible. And if you're sharing this with someone, tell them to start at the beginning. The beginning matters. Canada is a very large and very old and genuinely strange place. We have barely scratched the surface. Sleep well. On December 6th, 1917, at 9 o'clock in the morning, the city of Halifax, Nova Scotia, experienced the largest accidental explosion in human history before the nuclear age. The circumstances were the product of war and harbor congestion and a series of decisions that in hindsight form a chain of inevitability, but in the moment were simply the ordinary chaos of a wartime port. The harbor at Halifax was one of the most important in the Allied war effort. Convoys assembled there before crossing the Atlantic. The waters were busy with military and civilian vessels moving in multiple directions under the administrative pressure of the war. A French munition ship called the Mont Blanc was moving through the narrows of Halifax Harbor, making for the Bedford Basin where it would join a convoy. Its cargo was extraordinary in its destructiveness. The Mont Blanc was carrying 2,300 tons of picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, 35 tons of high-octane benzol in drums on its deck, and 10 tons of gun cotton. It was, by any measure, the most dangerous cargo afloat. Moving in the opposite direction through the Narrows was a Belgian relief ship called the Emo, which was heading out of the basin toward the harbor entrance. A series of navigation errors and miscommunications caused the two ships to be in the same channel, moving toward each other at a point where neither could easily turn. They collided at low speed. The benzol drums on the Mont Blanc's deck were ruptured. Fire began. The crew of the Mont Blanc, knowing what their cargo was, and knowing that no effort of theirs could prevent what was about to happen, abandoned ship. The burning vessel drifted toward Pier 6 in the Richmond neighborhood of Halifax North End. Hundreds of people gathered at windows and on the waterfront to watch the spectacular burning ship. At 9:45, the Mont Blanc exploded. The blast destroyed everything within a radius of roughly 2 kilometers and damaged structures across the entire city. The pressure wave shattered windows across Nova Scotia and was felt as far away as Prince Edward Island. The explosion produced a column of white smoke more than 3 kilometers high. The steel anchor of the Mont Blanc, which weighed over half a ton, was found 4 kilometers from the blast site. A tsunami caused by the explosion swept through the harbor. A pressure wave traveled outward and then returned. A second shock that hit structures that had already been weakened by the first. In the north end of Halifax, the Richmond neighborhood was simply erased. The homes and businesses and schools and churches of a working-class neighborhood that had existed for generations were gone. Fragments of the Mont Blanc rained down across the city. A rescue train arrived from Truro within hours and hit debris on the tracks and derailed. Nearly 2,000 people were killed. 9,000 were injured, many of them blinded by broken glass at the windows where they had been watching. 25,000 people were left without adequate shelter in the beginning of December in Nova Scotia. The city rebuilt. The north end was reconstructed. The railway line was cleared. Every year on December 6th, the province of Nova Scotia sends a Christmas tree to the city of Boston in acknowledgement of the assistance that Boston sent to Halifax in the hours and days after the explosion. The tradition has been unbroken since 1971. The tree goes to Boston Common, where it is decorated and lit, and people walk past it in December not always knowing what it means or why it is there. Halifax is a city built on bedrock and habit and the long memory of what can come in from the water without warning. The Narrows are still there. Ships still move through them. The harbor is still one of the most important on the East Coast. The anchor of the Mont Blanc is in a park in Dartmouth, across the harbor, where someone placed it as a memorial. It is very large. The Canadian government's involvement in the psychological experiments of the Cold War period is one of the chapters of Canadian history that tends to surprise people who have not encountered it, because it does not fit the image that Canada generally presents of itself. Between 1957 and 1964, at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, a psychiatrist named Donald Ewan Cameron conducted experiments on patients that have since become central to discussions of medical ethics, government oversight, and the responsibilities that institutions have toward the people in their care. Cameron was Scottish-born, American-trained, and at the peak of his professional career when he came to the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University. He had been president of the American Psychiatric Association and the World Psychiatric Association. He was, by every professional measure of the time, someone whose judgment and methods could be trusted. The methods that Cameron used at the Allen Memorial Institute were not standard psychiatric treatment. They were funded in part by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States through a front organization, and in part by the Canadian government through the Department of National Health and Welfare, and they were aimed at testing whether the human mind could be restructured through a process Cameron called psychic driving combined with depatterning. The theory was this: if you could erase a patient's existing mental patterns through sleep deprivation, drug-induced states, electroconvulsive therapy, administered at many times the standard therapeutic dosage, and prolonged sensory isolation, you would create a blank state from which a new, healthier set of patterns could be installed through repetitive audio messages played to the patient during their erased state. The patients who came to the Allen Memorial Institute for treatment of conditions like depression and anxiety did not know they were experimental subjects. They were not told what the treatments involved. Some of them were kept in drug-induced sleep for weeks at a time. Some received electroconvulsive therapy sessions measured not in the standard single shocks, but in dozens of repeated treatments. Some were given LSD, mescaline, and other psychoactive compounds as part of the treatment process. Some were placed in isolation rooms and subjected to prolonged sensory deprivation. The results were not the construction of healthy new personalities. The results were, in documented cases, the destruction of existing ones. Former patients have described emerging from treatment unable to remember significant portions of their lives, unable to recognize family members, unable to perform basic functions they had been able to perform before treatment. The erasure was real. The rebuilding was not. In 1977, a United States Senate investigation into the CIA's MKUltra program, which had funded Cameron's work, made the Montreal experiments public. In Canada, a parliamentary review followed. The Canadian government eventually settled with former patients and their families. The settlements were reached without any admission of liability or wrongdoing. Cameron died in 1967, 3 years after the experiments ended, while on a hiking trip in the Adirondacks. He had written extensively about his work and believed in it. The patients he treated did not all have the option of moving on with their lives, because the lives they had before treatment were no longer fully accessible to them. The Allen Memorial Institute is still part of McGill University. It still operates as a psychiatric facility. The history of what happened there is documented. It is part of the institution's formal history. The building is a Victorian mansion called Ravenscroft. It sits on the slope of Mount Royal, with a view of the city. If you travel to British Columbia and drive north along the coast, past Vancouver and through the coastal ranges, and into the territory of the central and northern BC interior, you will eventually enter a landscape that has been reporting something specific for a very long time. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the wild man of the woods, The names vary by region and culture. The reports do not. The indigenous nations of British Columbia's interior and coast have accounts of a large bipedal creature in the forests that predate European contact by centuries. The Estes Isles Nation, whose territory is in the Fraser Valley east of Vancouver, have a specific relationship with the creature they call Saskets, and the Sasquatch, which is itself an anglicization of a word from a coast Salish language, has been part of the spiritual and ecological knowledge of Pacific Northwest First Nations in a way that is distinct from the cryptid tourism framing that surrounds it in mainstream culture. The modern reports, meaning the reports that have been documented in the English language record since European settlement, number in the tens of thousands. They come from every region of British Columbia, from Alberta, from Washington State, Oregon, California, and points throughout North America. The consistency of the descriptions across this range, a large bipedal primate with distinctive proportions, a particular gait captured famously in the 1967 Patterson-Gimlin film, and a specific smell described consistently as extremely pungent and musky, is something that biologists who have studied the reports find difficult to explain through misidentification alone. The Patterson-Gimlin film, shot in October 1967 in Bluff Creek in Northern California near the Oregon border, is the most analyzed piece of film footage in cryptozoological history. It shows approximately 53 seconds of a large bipedal creature walking away from and then looking back toward the camera before entering the trees. The creature in the film has been analyzed by biomechanists, film experts, costume designers, and primatologists. The analysis has not produced consensus. Biomechanical analysis of the creature's gait has suggested that the movement, particularly the knee flexion and the counterbalancing of the upper body, is consistent with a very large primate, moving bipedally, and is difficult to produce in a hoax suit, because the proportions would make the gait mechanics nearly impossible for a human to replicate without mechanical assistance. Costume designers have argued that the construction of the suit, including the muscle movement, visible under the surface of the figure's body, was beyond the capability of 1967 film industry technology. Other analysts have argued that it is not. What is not disputed is that Roger Patterson and Robert Gimlin drove to Northern California specifically to film a Sasquatch, having had previous encounters and believed in the creature's existence, and that they returned with footage that has not been definitively proven a hoax in nearly 60 years of analysis. In British Columbia specifically, the reports continue. They come from loggers and hunters and hikers and people driving logging roads at night who see something cross in front of their headlights that is not a bear. They come from remote camera systems set up for wildlife monitoring that occasionally capture something large and upright that is moving in a way bears do not move. The scientific position is that a large primate species in North America would require a breeding population, and a breeding population would leave evidence, and the evidence has not been found. No body, no skeletal remains, no confirmed DNA from biological samples. The indigenous position in many communities is that you do not find what you are not supposed to find. The creature exists in relation to the forest in a way that the forest participates in. The forest is not a collection of objects to be sampled. It is a system with its own coherence, and some things in it are not available to the kind of looking that produces museum specimens. These are not compatible frameworks. They describe different relationships between the observer and the thing being observed. Both are taken seriously by the people who hold them. The forest continues. The reports continue. The cameras continue to be set up along the logging roads. The Klondike Gold Rush of 1896 to 1899 was one of the largest voluntary mass migrations in North American history. An estimated 100,000 people set out for the Yukon Territory in a period of less than 3 years, most of them without any realistic understanding of what they were about to attempt. Gold had been discovered in a Klondike River tributary called Rabbit Creek, renamed Bonanza Creek, after the strike in August of 1896 by a man named George Carmack and his indigenous companions Skookum, Jim Mason, and Dawson Charlie. The strike was extraordinary. The gold was there in quantities that made men rich who could barely believe it. The news reached the outside world in 1897 when ships arrived in Seattle and San Francisco carrying miners with sacks of gold, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Stampeders came from everywhere, from the United States and Canada and Britain and Australia and Germany and Scandinavia and South America. They came without experience, without proper equipment, without any real comprehension of what the Yukon winter was or what it would ask of them. The Canadian government, attempting to control access and prevent the chaos that was developing, required that anyone entering the Yukon through the main mountain passes carry a year's worth of supplies, roughly a ton of goods per person. The passes were Chilkoot and White, both of them brutal ascents through terrain that killed people. The photographs of the Chilkoot Pass from the winter of 1897 to 1898 are among the most remarkable images in Canadian history. A line of human figures climbing a near vertical slope through snow, each person carrying a load, each person looking at the feet of the person in front of them, stretching from the bottom of the frame to the top without interruption. Thousands of people in that line, in that cold, in that mountain. Some of them made it. Most of the gold was already claimed by the time the main wave of stampeders arrived. The men who had been in the Klondike at the time of the discovery, the ones who had staked claims in those first months, were the ones who became wealthy. The tens of thousands who arrived later found claims already staked and had to find work in the mines of men who had gotten there first, which was not what they had come for. Dawson City, which grew at the confluence of the Klondike and Yukon rivers, had a population of roughly 40,000 at its peak in 1898. By 1900, it had begun declining. By 1910, the gold rush was over and the population had fallen to a few thousand. What the gold rush left behind in the Klondike landscape was substantial. The mercury used in gold processing, the tailings piles from hydraulic mining operations that reshaped entire creek valleys, the buildings of a boomtown abandoned before they could be maintained, and the graves of the people who did not make it, some marked and some not, across the passes and along the trail to Dawson and in the hills outside the city. There is a place in the Klondike region where during excavations and erosion events, human remains occasionally surface from the permafrost. The permafrost preserves what it holds. The gold, rushed dead where they were buried, and where the ground was cold enough, have been preserved in ways that the intervening century has not entirely undone. The land holds what it holds. Sometimes the thaw returns it. Lac Mégantic is a town of about 5,000 people in the eastern townships of Quebec, built around a lake from which it takes its name, in the kind of valley that holds its landscape close. The lake is cold and clear. The town around it is old, in the way that Quebec towns are old, with a particular weight to the architecture and the street plan that comes from buildings that have been where they are for a long time. On July 6, 2013, in the early hours of the morning, a train carrying crude oil from North Dakota rolled downhill from a rail junction several kilometers outside town and derailed in the town center. The train was 72 tank cars of Bakken crude oil. The crude oil ignited. The explosion and fire that followed killed 47 people. Most of them were in the downtown bar district, which was active at 1 a.m. on a weekend. The fire burned for days. The downtown core of Lac Mégantic was destroyed. Petroleum and firefighting water contaminated Chaudière River, which drains the lake. The investigation that followed found a chain of regulatory and corporate failures of a kind that is familiar from other industrial disasters: insufficient oversight, inadequate safety protocols, understaffed train operations, and a regulatory environment that had been loosened in ways that the disaster made impossible to defend. The company that operated the train, Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic Railway, went bankrupt after the disaster. 3 employees were charged with criminal negligence causing death. All 3 were acquitted. Lac Mégantic rebuilt. The downtown that was destroyed was cleared and a new one constructed. The lake is still there. The community is still there. The 47 people are not there. Their names are on a memorial in the center of the rebuilt downtown. The memorial is very quiet, and the lake behind the town reflects whatever sky is above it. There is a final quality of Canada that is worth sitting with, and it has to do with size. 10 million square kilometers is a number that resists comprehension until you have tried to cross the country and felt the days accumulating in a way that nothing but scale produces. The boreal forest that covers the middle and north of the country is the largest intact forest ecosystem on Earth. Its carbon storage capacity is significant. Its ecological complexity is not fully mapped. The species that live in it, the mammals and birds and insects and fungi and plants, include ones that have not been formally described. New species continue to be found in the boreal. The forest is not fully inventoried. The Canadian Arctic archipelago, the islands that fan out into the Arctic Ocean above the mainland, contains 291 islands. Some of them have been visited rarely, if at all, by anyone outside the Inuit communities whose territory they occupy. The waters around them are changing as the climate changes, and the ice that used to make navigation impossible is becoming navigable in summer months, which means that shipping routes and resource extraction interests are moving into waters that were, until recently, effectively closed. The permafrost that underlies much of northern Canada is thawing. As it thaws, it is releasing carbon that has been stored in it for thousands of years. It is also releasing things that were preserved in it: animal remains, plant material. In Siberia, which has similar permafrost and similar thaw dynamics, intact animals thousands of years old have emerged from the thaw. In Canada, similar preservation is occurring. What is in the permafrost, what it has been holding, is becoming visible at the same time that the permafrost itself is changing in ways that will alter the landscape for centuries. The rivers are changing. The tree lines are moving north. The species ranges are shifting. The grizzly bears are moving into polar bear territory, and the 2 species are producing hybrid offspring that have been documented and given a name. The landscape is in motion in a way that is faster than the landscape should be in motion. And underneath all of this movement, underneath the thaw and the shift and the new roots opening in waters that used to be closed, the land is what it has always been: old, vast, holding more than we know. Canada has been called a young country. In one sense it is. Confederation was 1867. The Constitution was patriated from Britain in 1982. These are recent events by any historical standard, but the land is not young. The Precambrian Shield, the ancient rock formation that underlies most of central Canada, and that is one of the oldest exposed geological formations on Earth, is 2.5 to 4 billion years old. The mountains of British Columbia are young by geological standards. The plains of the prairies were under a shallow sea not that long ago in geological time. The Great Lakes are the remnants of a glaciation that ended 10,000 years ago. The people who were here before European contact had been here for at least 14,000 years, possibly longer. 14,000 years of accumulated knowledge. of learning what the land asks and what it offers and what it withholds, of naming things and watching things and building frameworks for understanding things that the frameworks of other civilizations had not yet encountered. That knowledge was not destroyed entirely. It was suppressed and damaged, and the intergenerational transmission was interrupted in ways that are still being repaired. But it was not destroyed. It exists in communities and in archives and in living memory and in the land itself, which does not forget what has happened on it or what has been asked of it. Canada is a country that does not always know what it is. That uncertainty is part of what makes it strange in the specific way it is strange. Not malevolent, not haunted in the Gothic sense, but genuinely uncertain in a way that comes from being the intersection of the oldest continuous human inhabitation on the continent with one of the youngest national frameworks for organizing that inhabitation. The money pit is still down there. The lights are still in the outback. The ships are still in the ice. The graves are still in the ground. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets, and the land goes on being what it is, indifferent to whether we understand it, patient in the way that things are patient when they have been here longer than we have, and will be here long after we are done. There is a river in northern Ontario called the Albany, and it runs from Lake St. Joseph east through the boreal forest for approximately 900 kilometers before reaching James Bay. The Albany is not a famous river. It does not appear on most tourist maps. It is not the kind of river that gets written about in travel magazines. But the Albany River watershed encompasses an area larger than most European countries, and for the Cree people who have lived along it for thousands of years, it is the organizing principle of an entire way of life. The Mushkegowuk Cree of the Albany River region have a relationship with the land that is expressed in the kind of knowledge that accumulates when people have been paying very close attention to the same ecosystem for a very long time. The Albany River drains into James Bay, which in turn connects to Hudson Bay, and the whole system is one of the most significant freshwater drainage basins on the continent. The fish populations, the waterfowl, the beaver and moose that the watershed supports were the resource base of an entire civilization. The James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement of 1975 was one of the first modern land claim agreements between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian government. It was negotiated because the Quebec government had decided to develop the hydroelectric potential of the rivers flowing into James Bay, rivers that the Cree and Inuit depended on, without consulting the people who live there. The project was enormous. The La Grande complex alone flooded an area of land larger than the state of Connecticut. The agreement that resulted from the Cree and Inuit legal challenge was in some respects a milestone. It was the first comprehensive land claim agreement in Canadian history. It established rights and benefits for the Cree and Inuit communities in the region. It also flooded the land. The hydroelectric project changed the hydrology of an entire watershed. The mercury that occurs naturally in the flooded soils was released into the water system and bioaccumulated in fish tissue. The Cree people, who ate the fish from those rivers, began showing elevated mercury levels. The studies documenting this were careful, and the findings were unambiguous. The people who ate the fish from the reservoir were accumulating mercury. The project generated electricity. The electricity powers southern Quebec. The lights in Montreal are on because of what happened to the Albany River watershed and the rivers around it. The Cree communities are still there. The rivers are still there, changed. The fish are still there, still with elevated mercury in some populations. The lights in Montreal are still on. This is not an unusual story in Canadian terms. It is the kind of story that recurs in different forms across the country, and it is one of the reasons that Canadian history, the further you go into it, keeps producing the specific kind of strangeness that comes from looking at the distance between what was said and what was done. In the province of British Columbia, on a stretch of coastline north of Vancouver Island, there is an archipelago called Haida Gwaii. It was known for most of the 20th century by its colonial name, the Queen Charlotte Islands, but the Haida Nation, who have lived there for at least 10,000 years, call it Haida Gwaii, which means something close to Islands of the People. The name was officially restored by the provincial government in 2010. Haida Gwaii is ecologically extraordinary. Because the islands were largely free of glaciation during the last ice age, while the mainland was covered by ice, they served as a refugium for species that were eliminated elsewhere. The result is a degree of endemism, species found only on Haida Gwaii and nowhere else on Earth, that is unusual for a temperate island group. The forests are Sitka spruce and red cedar of extraordinary age and size. The marine environment around the islands, where the cold waters of the Pacific, mixing with the nutrient-rich upwelling, create one of the most productive ocean ecosystems on the coast, supports concentrations of marine mammals and seabirds that are among the highest on the continent. The Haida people have a cultural tradition that is, by the assessment of art, historians and anthropologists, one of the most sophisticated in the world. The totem poles of the Haida are not decorative. They are documents. Each figure on a pole records lineage, rites, significant events, relationships between families and clans, and the non-human beings that share the territory. The carving tradition, temporarily suppressed during the period of most intense colonial pressure, has been revived with extraordinary vitality. The poles being raised now are as complex and precise as any that were raised before. The Haida also have a governance system based on two clans, the Eagle and the Raven, and a set of protocols for managing relationships between families, between humans and the non-human world, and between the living and the dead that has functioned continuously for thousands of years. The system is still functioning. In the 1980s, a conflict over logging in the old-growth forests of Haida Gwaii produced a confrontation that became a defining moment in the history of both Indigenous rights and environmental activism in Canada. The Haida blocked logging roads, people were arrested, the confrontation was covered nationally. The forests that were being logged were not abstract forests, they were the specific forests of a specific archipelago that the Haida had managed and inhabited for 10 millennia. The logging continued in some areas. It was stopped in others. The islands now have significant protected areas, including the Gwaii National Park Reserve and Haida Heritage Site, which is co-managed by the Haida Nation and Parks Canada in a model that has been studied by other Indigenous nations and governments around the world. The old-growth trees that were logged are gone. The stumps of them are still visible in the areas that were cut, enormous cross-sections of trees that were hundreds of years old when they were felled, now slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The trees growing up through the clear cuts are young. They will be old eventually, not in any time frame that currently living people will observe, but eventually. The northern lights, the aurora borealis, have been observed from Canada for as long as people have been in Canada. The Cree have stories about them. The Inuit have stories about them. The stories vary across cultures, but they share a consistent quality. The lights are not simply atmospheric phenomena to be explained away. They are entities or communications or presences that interact with the world in ways that physical description alone does not fully capture. The science of the aurora is understood reasonably well now. Solar wind particles interact with the Earth's magnetic field and are directed toward the polar regions, where they collide with atmospheric gases and produce light. The color of the light depends on the altitude and the specific gas. Oxygen at high altitude produces red. Oxygen at lower altitude produces green. Nitrogen produces blue and purple. The patterns and forms of the aurora, the curtains and pillars and coronas that appear and shift and vanish, are the visual manifestation of complex electromagnetic dynamics at the boundary between the atmosphere and near space. This explanation is accurate. It is also, in a specific way, incomplete in the same way that a technical description of how music produces sound through vibrating air. Molecules is accurate but incomplete in its account of what music does. The aurora makes sounds. This is something that indigenous oral traditions across the north have documented for a long time. Sounds associated with the lights described as hissing or crackling, or in some accounts as more complex sounds. Western science was, for a long time, skeptical of this because the mechanisms by which sound waves could travel from the altitude at which aurora occurs to ground level were not well understood. The sound should dissipate before it reaches the surface. In 2016, Finnish researchers studying the aurora found that aurora-associated sounds were real and were occurring within approximately 70 meters of the Earth's surface, not propagating down from the altitude of the lights themselves. The mechanism involves the interaction of temperature inversions in the lower atmosphere with the electrical dynamics associated with geomagnetic disturbances. The sound is generated locally, near the ground, as a secondary effect of the same electromagnetic events that produce the visible lights. The people who had documented these sounds for centuries, who had built them into their understanding of what the aurora was and how it behaved, were describing something real. The mechanism they used to explain it was different from the mechanism Western science eventually identified, but the observation was accurate. This pattern of indigenous observation that turns out, when eventually tested, to be accurate, recurs throughout Canadian natural history. The Heiltsuk Nation of coastal British Columbia described herring spawn patterns in specific locations that their oral traditions had documented across generations. When marine biologists studied those locations, they found that the spawn sites were exactly where the oral tradition said they were. The knowledge was not mythological. It was ecological, encoded in narrative, maintained across more generations than any written record. Canada's relationship with its own history has been changing in the last 30 years in ways that are significant and, to an extent, unprecedented. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, the ground-penetrating radar surveys at former residential school sites, the restoration of Indigenous place names to landscapes that had been renamed during the colonial period, the legal recognition of Indigenous title in Supreme Court decisions that have changed the framework within which resource development and land use are negotiated. These changes are real. They are also, in the scale of what they are responding to, still early. The unmarked graves that the radar surveys are finding are not symbolic. They are physical. They contain the remains of children who were removed from their families and did not come home. The families of those children have been waiting for answers in some cases for more than a century. The answers are coming now because the technology to find the graves has arrived, and the political will to look has been assembled, and the communities that held the knowledge of what happened have been saying for decades that it needed to be looked for. The archives that hold the records of the residential schools are extensive. The churches and the government both kept records. The records are imperfect and in many cases incomplete, particularly regarding deaths, but they exist and they are being examined. The process of matching records to sites, of identifying who is buried where, is a painstaking and emotionally demanding process that is being led by the communities most affected. The Canadian government has committed to funding the search process. The commitment is being monitored. The communities are holding the government to it. This is how a country looks when it is trying to account for itself. Not always successfully, not without the kinds of delays and complications and insufficient responses that characterize institutions doing something hard. But the accounting is happening. The deeper the digging goes, the more there is to find, and the finding matters even when it is painful. Especially when it is painful. The land holds what has happened on it. Canada is a land that is very old and that has held a great deal. The process of learning what it holds is not complete. There is a geological feature in Manitoba called the Kelsey Generating Station Reservoir, and there is a feature in northern Quebec called the La Grande Reservoir Complex, and there is a feature in British Columbia called the Williston Lake Reservoir, and all of these are places where land that was once dry is now underwater and has been underwater for decades, and where what used to be there, the trees and the soil, and in some cases the communities, is now at the bottom of a lake. Reservoir lakes in Canada cover an enormous aggregate area. The development of hydroelectric power in Canada over the 20th century required the flooding of river valleys, the relocation of communities, and the transformation of landscapes that had been stable for thousands of years. The generation of that power is why most Canadians have reliable electricity. The cost of it was paid by the land that was flooded and the people who lived on that land. When the reservoirs are drawn down for maintenance or during drought conditions, the landscape that was flooded is sometimes briefly visible again. Trees that were drowned decades ago, preserved in the cold and the silt, emerge from the water. The outlines of roads that no longer go anywhere, the foundations of buildings, the shapes of fields that were shaped by people who are no longer there. The land that is under the water still knows its own contours. The rivers remember which way they used to run. When the water level drops enough, you can see the old river channels at the bottom of the reservoir, the original course of the water before the dam changed everything, running through the silt like memory. One final thing before we close. There is a lighthouse at Peggy's Cove in Nova Scotia that is possibly the most photographed lighthouse in Canada. It sits on a granite outcropping above the Atlantic, and the waves that hit the rock on the right day are the kind of waves that end conversations. The rock is smooth and worn and very old, and the lighthouse is white against the sky, and every year hundreds of thousands of people drive out to the end of the road and get out of their cars and walk as close to the edge as they dare and take photographs. Peggy's Cove is about 40 kilometers from the spot in the Atlantic where in September 1998, Swiss Air Flight 111 crashed into the ocean, killing all 229 people on board. The local fishermen who went out immediately when the plane came down, before any official rescue operation was organized, to see if anyone had survived, found no survivors. They found debris. They found remains in the water. The fishermen of Peggy's Cove and the surrounding communities, who had not asked for this, who had no preparation or training for what they encountered, went out repeatedly in the days after the crash to assist with the recovery operation. The impact of what they encountered in that water has been documented by those communities and by the health professionals who worked with them afterward. A memorial park was established near Peggy's Cove for the victims of Flight 111. It has two elements. One is a granite outcrop similar to the rock at the lighthouse, carved with the names of all 229 people. The other is a small section of the same Swiss granite brought from Switzerland, a piece of the geography that the passengers came from, placed beside the Canadian granite of the place where they came down. Two stones from two different countries, the ocean between them, the names of 229 people. This is also Canada. not just the strange and the unresolved and the dark, also the lighthouse on the rock, also the fishermen who went out when they didn't have to, also the names carved into stone so that the people they belong to are not simply gone. The country contains all of it, the pit and the lighthouse, the valley and the graves, the lights in the sky and the lights in the windows of the houses where people are having dinner and not thinking about any of this, just living their lives in the second largest country on earth, surrounded by more space than most people on this planet will ever know. That space is real. It holds things, and the longer you look at it, the more of what it holds becomes visible. We have been looking tonight, and what we have found is not the final inventory. It is the beginning of one. There is always more. There is something specific that happens when you read Canadian history carefully, all the way through, without the protective layer of national narrative that tends to soften things into a more manageable shape. What happens is that you start to notice how many of the stories share a structural feature that is easy to miss when you look at them individually. The feature is this: something happened. It was documented. The documentation was filed. The accountability that should have followed did not follow, or followed incompletely, or followed in a form that did not correspond to the scale of what had happened. The Donnelly family. 26 people died and no one was convicted of anything. The residential schools. The institutions operated for over a century and no administrator or priest or government official was ever imprisoned for what happened to the children inside them. The Westray mine. 26 men died in documented, preventable conditions and no one served a day in prison. The Highway of Tears. The disappearances continued for 5 decades before the United Nations became involved. This is not a pattern of coincidence. It is a pattern of how accountability functions in systems that protect themselves. The pattern exists in other countries too. Canada is not unique in having it, but Canada has a particular relationship with the pattern because of the degree to which Canada's self-image is invested in the idea of fairness and reasonableness and the rule of law, and the degree to which the historical record complicates that investment. Sitting with that complication is uncomfortable. It is also, the historical evidence suggests, necessary. A country that cannot account for what happened inside it is a country that carries those things unresolved, and unresolved things have a way of repeating in different forms. The accountability question is live in Canada right now in a way it has not always been. The residential school discoveries accelerated a conversation that had been happening at low volume for a long time. The national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women raised questions that are still being answered. The land rights decisions coming from the Supreme Court are reshaping the framework within which resource and land questions are negotiated. This is not resolution. It is the beginning of reckoning. And reckoning, in a country this large and this old, takes time. If you have stayed with this through everything, you know now that Canada is a country of extraordinary and genuine strangeness. The strangeness is not all dark. The boreal forest in autumn is one of the most beautiful ecosystems on earth. The light through the birch and aspen in October, a yellow so pure and deep, it seems to come from inside the leaves rather than from the sky. The mountains of British Columbia, the Rockies, and the Coast Range, and the hadrosaur fossil-rich badlands of Alberta are landscapes that stop people in the middle of whatever they were doing and make them stand still. The northern lights on a clear winter night in Yukon or the Northwest Territories are something that no description fully transmits. You have to be there. You have to be cold and small under them and understand that you are watching charged particles from the sun hitting the outermost skin of the atmosphere, and that the universe is so much larger than the human frame can comfortably hold. The strange things that Canada holds are not separate from its beauty. They are part of the same coherent whole. A country of 10 million square kilometers has room for things that are not yet understood. A country of that age has accumulated things that have not yet been accounted for. A country built on that particular intersection of indigenous knowledge and colonial history and geological age is going to produce a record that rewards careful reading. Canada rewards careful reading. Tonight, we did some of that reading together. The pit on the island, going down and flooding whenever you get close. The valley where the hot springs steam in the northern cold, and the deaths have accumulated without explanation. The government scientist whose files disappeared after he died, taking with him whatever he had concluded. The painter floating face down in a lake he knew better than almost anyone, and the skull with a hole in it found 40 years later in the same soil. The craft that went into the ocean and moved under the water and was tracked on sonar until it wasn't. The families on the highway waiting for decades for information that some of them never received. All of it is real. All of it is documented in the sense that there are records and witnesses and physical evidence that form the basis of each account. What the records don't provide, what the investigation and the inquiry and the survey has not yet provided, is the full explanation. The full explanation may come. In some cases, it almost certainly will. In others, the record may simply remain what it is, a set of carefully documented events with a gap at the center where the answer should be. Canada is comfortable with that in the specific way that a country with that much space and that much history learns to be comfortable with the things it does not know. The boreal forest covers half the country and has not been fully inventoried. The Arctic archipelago has islands that have been visited rarely. The permafrost is thawing and releasing what it held, and the inventory of what it held is still being taken. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets, and the country is deep. The country is very deep. Sleep well.